Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Heather Bullock, and I'm the immediate past president of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, or SPISI. I'm also the director of the Center for Economic Justice and Action and a professor of psychology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. We're excited to celebrate the release of Rethinking Inequality, using psychological science to advance economic justice. This cross-divisional policy project brought together psychologists from academia, healthcare, and government to examine the effects of inequality and offer real-world solutions. You can find the complete volume on SPISI's website. We will also post a link. We hope you will download it and that it will become a valuable resource and powerful call to action. We are so thankful for our wonderful divisional partners on this project, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, the Division on Adult Development and Aging, the Society for the Psychology of Women, the Society for Child and Family Policy and Practice, the Society for Health Psychology, the American Psychology Law Society, and the Psychology of Social Class Organization. Funding from the American Psychological Association Committee on Division APA Relations helped make this project possible, and we're grateful for their support. I want to give very special thanks to Sam Abbott, SPISI's Communications and Policy Director. Sam and I worked on this project from its inception, and his contributions were absolutely essential to bringing this project to fruition. Please note that any opinions or conclusions expressed in Rethinking Inequality and the webinar series are those of the individual contributors and do not reflect the views of participating organizations or the American Psychological Association or any of their subunits or divisions. In the United States and around the world, economic inequality is among the defining issues of our time. Last year, 1% of U.S. households controlled nearly 1/3 of all wealth, while half of the country struggled for less than 3%. Such disparity is not only socially corrosive, but also democratically and economically unsustainable. Rethinking Inequality challenges the all too common dismissal of economic inequality as too big or inevitable, just impossible to take on. Instead, we make the case that poverty and economic inequality are the result of policy choices, and that we can, in fact, reduce inequality if we want to. We also make clear why psychological science is essential to understanding and reversing inequality. Each paper shows how inequality results from systems that constrain opportunity and distribute risks unevenly across communities, not individual shortcomings. Today's webinar, Legal and Economic Justice, is our third of 3 webinar series discussing the volume. The U.S. legal and economic systems are symbiotic, with disparities in one reflected in the other. The legal system should uphold our rights and protections, including the right to a quality education, to organize and collectively bargain, to engage in the political process, and to pursue our lives and own economic paths. It should protect us from discrimination, unsafe living and working conditions, and exploitation. Unfortunately, access to the U.S. legal system is not equitable, and legal services are very expensive and inaccessible. This creates financial burdens and roadblocks for low-income individuals and families, regardless of the merits of their case. Policymakers must decouple equal protection under the law from the ability to pay for it. Only then will economic justice be possible. Today's authors from the Society for Health Psychology and the American Psychology Law Society examine how the legal system can either reinforce or alleviate economic inequality. We'll have time at the end for Q&A with the presenters. First, we will hear from Dr. Shannon Perkins and Cyan Alexis, who will discuss their paper, When Legal Help is Healthcare: Medical Legal Partnerships as a Tool for Health Equity and Cost Savings. Their brief demonstrates how access to legal services in areas such as housing, family law, and benefits access reduces stress, improves health outcomes, and stabilizes families. Dr. Perkins has been employed as a clinical health psychologist for almost 25 years. She has served in various clinical and leadership roles at the Cleveland Clinic Foundation and Summa Health System in Akron, Ohio, throughout her career. She is currently the director of behavioral health and integrated behavioral health at Summa's Family Medicine Residency Program, where she served on the residency faculty for the past 9 years. She's passionate about social justice and addressing social barriers to healthcare for community members. Cyan Alexis is a PhD candidate in her 5th year of study in the counseling psychology program at the University of Akron. She currently works in the psychology trainee practicum student as a psychology trainee practicum student with the supervision of her co-presenter, Dr. Perkins. Outside of her contributions to today's webinar, she studies health disparities, and her dissertation focuses on the barriers and facilitators of mental health service utilization among Black Americans. If you're interested in learning more about your dissertation, she encourages people to reach out to her. So I hope that you will. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our first presenters. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
Thank you. Are you able to see our slides? Are the slides showing?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so I'm gonna start us off here with saying thank you all for attending and being willing to listen and learn with us. Dr. Perkins and I will mostly be discussing in a shorter way of saying this title, how legal help impacts healthcare. So with that being said, let's get started. One of the biggest problems facing the United States is poverty. It is extremely prevalent in the US. So 13% of Americans live in poverty. That is 1 in 7 children. And 50% of households with single women or single mothers are affected by poverty. Also, this includes a statistic of twice as many Black Americans than white Americans are impacted by poverty. So that issue of marginalization and intersectionality all come into play. Something else that's important to know is over 700,000 Americans have experienced homelessness. And this statistic is drawn from stats collected in 2024-ish from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. These are the most recent numbers that they have published. 37% of families spend over 30% of their income on rent. So with over 30% of their income being spent on rent, that leaves insufficient funds for utilities, food, clothing, healthcare, and increased risk for housing insecurity and evictions. These inequitable social conditions lead to inequitable health outcomes. Evictions lead to increased risk of hospital admissions. Poor housing conditions are linked to respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, infectious disease, anxiety, and depression. And another thing that's important to note is unemployment is linked to increased rates of suicide and substance abuse. So a lot of stress impacting a lot of different areas, and all of these are caused by social problems. This graphic really highlights that social factors are driving health outcomes the most among US adults. However, social service spending is not catered to as much in the United States as healthcare spending. There's a much higher threshold for spending on our healthcare services, but the driver for healthcare is all of these social inequalities.
Okay, so we have a lot of information that tells us about the prevalence of poverty and the enormous impact of poverty on health. So for those of us working in healthcare, how do we help our patients be healthier? How do we address these social challenges that we are maybe not equipped to really address and solve in a healthcare setting? One solution is a medical legal partnership. And what a medical legal partnership does is it brings an attorney onto the healthcare team. And that attorney can address what we call health harming legal needs. So examples of health harming legal needs can be evictions, substandard housing conditions, things like Social Security overpayments, intimate partner violence, immigration issues. The list can go on and on. But those are just a couple of examples of what we call health harming legal needs. So how does a medical legal partnership work? I ran a program for 4.5 years. This is roughly how our program functioned. A healthcare team member would identify a health harming legal need. For example, a patient would tell our behavioral health consultant that they had been served with an eviction notice. The behavioral health consultant would place a referral to legal aid. In some programs, the hospital actually employs an attorney who's physically on site. That would have been my dream come true. In most programs, it's more of a referral relationship. So we would place a referral to legal aid for eviction. Legal aid would then meet with the patient, gather more information, determine if they were able to help. And then they would determine what level of assistance the patient would need. Sometimes they could simply offer advice, and the patient could address the issue on their own with just some specialized advice. In other cases, they would actually represent the person in court. And then the legal services were paid for by our health system through philanthropy and grants. And we would have monthly meetings between our legal team and our integrated behavioral health and social work team to touch base on recent patients we had referred, what were the outcomes of the legal interventions, sometimes assisting if the legal aid team had trouble reaching a patient, things like that. So that's an example of how a medical legal partnership can function. There is a lot of research that tells us that medical legal partnerships positively impact health. You can imagine that stopping an eviction from happening would significantly reduce stress, right, for the person in that situation. These programs increase access to food assistance and income support. They make it more likely that a patient will show up to see their primary care physician, take medications that are prescribed, and be able to engage in treatment that their doctor is recommending. They're more likely to have safer, more stable housing, utilities, workplace accommodations. A lot of studies show specific improvement in chronic diseases like asthma, diabetes. So I could go on and on. There's a lot of research here. I wanted to give a couple of examples from the program that I ran for several years, for those of you that may be unfamiliar, so you can kind of see how these programs would function. So one case we had a 66-year-old deaf male, and he had received a Social Security overpayment notice stating that he had been overpaid over $100,000. And therefore, they completely terminated his income and his Medicare coverage. And so how is the average person supposed to take on Social Security Administration? He didn't get answers to his phone calls. He didn't know how to advocate for himself. He went 6 months without receiving any payments. He was not able to receive any health care during that time. He was unable to pay his mortgage. Legal aid was able to file an appeal. The overpayment was completely in error on the side of Social Security Administration. So he was able to get all of his back pay, his monthly payments restored, and he had his Medicare premiums paid so that he had his health insurance back. So that was a great example. This next example, we actually had many examples just like this one. A young family living in a rental home with broken windows, broken door frames, broken furnace, unsealed plumbing, unstable walls, just absolutely not the conditions that you want your children to be living with. The mother had post-traumatic stress disorder from a previous abusive relationship. The young child had asthma. How were we as her healthcare providers supposed to treat those conditions when the family was living in this unsafe environment every day? Legal aid was able to represent this patient and family in court. They helped the mother to document the conditions of the housing, the communications with the landlord who was refusing to fix the conditions. They deposited their rent money in escrow with the court. They had to ride it out for several months, but ultimately they were able to get $17,000 back, and it allowed them to put down a down payment to purchase their own home, rather than being stuck in a really terrible living situation. So this would have been a really difficult situation for this patient to navigate without this type of legal assistance. So you can see these two examples highlight not only how medical legal partnership services would have improved the health of the family and the patients involved, but also it benefited them financially and removed financial harm. There is some research, not enough, not as much as the research on impact of medical legal partnerships on health outcomes. There is some research on medical legal partnerships financial impact. So these programs not only help the patients financially, but they also provide cost savings for hospital systems by reducing hospitalizations, by connecting patients with their health insurance so that hospitals can be paid for the services rendered, addressing housing insecurity and social access to health insurance and social security and things like that. So we need some more research there, but there's definitely some decent evidence that shows that financial impact. And it's harder to quantify the cost of eviction and the cost savings of preventing an eviction. But if you think about a person who's really struggling financially and having to go through an eviction, if they're evicted and they need to find a new place, they have to come up with first month's rent and security deposit when they probably have very little money left over to survive. Moving expenses, hiring a rental truck, things like that. There's a huge shortage of affordable housing. So where is this a person supposed to go? There are 100 families seeking low-income housing for every 35 housing units that are considered affordable housing. There's a huge increased risk of homelessness after eviction, and renters often get stuck in kind of poor conditions due to these financial limitations. So I think it's safe to say that we could all agree people living in poverty should have access to legal services to protect their basic rights to safety and security. And the sad fact is they don't have that access. 92% of people living in poverty do not have access to legal services. There is no federal constitutional right to state-funded counsel for civil legal needs the way there is for criminal matters. Medical legal partnerships can help bridge this gap. But we don't have nearly enough for starters. There are about 450 medical legal partnership programs in the United States, and for example, there are 6,000 plus hospitals in the United States. So if we think maybe even a starting point might be every hospital in the U.S. should have a medical legal partnership program, we're nowhere close to that. And 80% of medical legal partnerships have unsustainable funding streams, like the one that I was running, which no longer exists due to unsustainable funding streams. So this is a program that shows a lot of promise, but really needs more resources to extend the availability of it. So some things have happened that have set the stage for Medicaid and Medicare funding for medical legal partnership services, which is really where we need to get to. HRSA has designated MLP services as an enabling service, which does allow medical centers to use federal dollars to pay for these services. HRSA has awarded grants for medical legal partnerships. The Public Health Services Act has designated that services that help patients gain access to programs that address social needs is considered case management, therefore should be reimbursable by Medicaid. North Carolina had a pilot program called the Healthy Opportunities Program that was funded by Medicaid Section 1115 waiver, and it provided medical legal partnership services amongst other social services. And so we need a lot more programs just like this. So our general policy recommendations are these. CMS can declare legal services that legal services to address health-harming legal needs are reimbursable health care. States can further test MLP implementation and service delivery through Medicaid Section 1115 waivers, like that North Carolina program I mentioned. Congress can authorize Medicaid reimbursement for medical legal partnerships through discretionary grants or a permanent amendment to the Social Security Act. And the government can contribute resources on implementation of medical legal partnerships. They can fund long-term implementation studies, which we need more of. They can release medical legal partnership implementation toolkits to assist other hospitals in implementing programs like this. Okay, so I think that covers everything we wanted to cover today. I put a link in here for the National Center for Medical Legal Partnership website, which is a really great resource if you're interested in learning more. And my email is here as well. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about, and I'm excited for time for questions. Next, we'll hear from Doctors Jen Perillo and Sarah Appleby, who will discuss their paper, Ending the Criminalization of Poverty. Their policy brief explores how fines, fees, cash bail, and punitive administrative practices criminalize poverty and trap individuals in cycles of debt, incarceration, and stigmatization. Dr. Perillo is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center. Her research focuses on intersections of psychology and the legal system, including legal decision-making, diversion and deflection, preventing wrongful convictions, and improving legal system outcomes, particularly for individuals with behavioral health needs and individuals experiencing systemic disparities in the legal system, including race, gender, and economic status. Dr. Perillo is also an associate editor for Law and Human Behavior and serves as treasurer for the American Psychology Law Society. Dr. Appleby is an associate professor of psychology at Mercer University's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Her research focuses on legal decision-making, and she's particularly interested in how race and socioeconomic status affect legal decision-making from all angles. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us today.
Thank you, Heather. Let's see here. All right, I'm going to start us off, and then I'm going to give kind of an overview of the problem, and then I will hand it off to Jen to talk about our reform suggestions. So first things first, when does poverty become a crime, right? It's not written into the law. It is illegal to not have money, but what has happened all across the US, dating, back hundreds of years, is that laws and policies have been put into effect that criminalize the behaviors of people living in poverty. So you could probably pick any jurisdiction at random in the US and you would find something like panhandling is illegal, sleeping in your car is illegal, sleeping outside is illegal, loitering is illegal. And none of these things are technically a crime. We're not talking violent crime here, but policies have put it in place where you can arrest people who are doing that. And who's most likely to be doing that? People living in poverty. And then once you've been brought into the criminal legal system, you're often forced to pay money to get out of the criminal legal system to resolve the situation. If you are arrested and booked in jail, many jurisdictions across the US, you have to pay bail to get out of jail. Some offenses, you're charged a fine or a fee. Both of these situations, money you didn't really have to begin with. And in some cases, you might have to pay bail and then pay court and legal fees. And this traps people into a cycle that I will discuss in coming slides. All right. Shelley, the story of Shelley is a really great example of how this can happen. Shelley and her husband, when their Social Security benefits kicked in, their SNAP benefits were cut off. They ended up losing their housing. They were sleeping outside, didn't have a lot of money for food. So one day, Shelley goes shopping for food and she pays for some of it and she puts some of it in her pocketbook. She is noticed and caught and arrested, and she's charged with a misdemeanor crime. She was told she would have, to pay $800. Her bail was $800. She would have, most places you have to pay at least 10% of that to get out. Oftentimes it's more. And then in addition to her bail fees, she was charged additional fees, such as a jail fee, which is a fee paying for your own place in jail, and a public defender fee. If you want to read more about Shelley, just Google, I've got the title here, The Bail Project, Homeless but Hopeful. It details her story. Shelley was actually lucky in that the Bail Project stepped in and were able to help her with these fines and fees and help her through the system. But the situation in general, unfortunately, is not unique. Over the course of our nation's history, millions, maybe billions of people have been put in similar situations. And so I want to give a little bit historical, political landscape of kind of how did the criminalization of poverty come about? Because understanding that is important in dismantling it. So as we see often when there is progress in the US, there is often a backlash to that progress. And elected officials, politicians will try to kind of claw some of that progress back. So, for example, after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, except as a punishment for crime. So then the powers that be, they put laws on the books that essentially criminalize poverty. You'll hear the term anti-vagrancy laws. And these laws were specifically targeted at Black Americans and non-white immigrants to get them into prison so that they could recoup the free labor. And unfortunately, there are many states today where this is still in practice. Georgia, where I live and work, does not pay incarcerated people for their work, even though they're working for 5-day weeks, 4 to 5 day weeks. Another example, post-civil rights movement, we see people trying to claw back some of that progress. All the politicians are walking around with this law and order rhetoric and proposing all these tough on crime policies. Many of them, again, criminalize the behaviors of people living in poverty. And of course, these laws were mostly targeted at non-white Americans. And at this point in time, what was also happening was there was a reduction in social services, funding, and an increase in spending in funding the criminal legal system. All right. So I referenced when I was talking about Shelley, the cycle of the criminalization of poverty. And what we see, this cycle that people have been trapped in for almost all of US history, is that, like I said, the behaviors associated with poverty, and also we see with mental illness, are criminalized. Those people, people get arrested. They cannot afford to pay their bail. They often have to sit in jail awaiting trial or awaiting meeting with a public defender to decide whether they should plead guilty or go to trial. We often see that most criminal cases are resolved via plea bargain, 95% of all cases estimate. And people who are, unable to pay bail, they often take a bad plea deal as a way to kind of get out of their immediate situation, which is jail. So what ends up happening is they take a bad deal, they maybe get a longer sentence, or if they do choose to go to trial, they aren't as able to help their attorneys. So, their outcomes at trial are poor. You end up with, a longer sentence, more monetary sanctions that the person couldn't afford in the first place. And then those fines and fees, they pile up. You may get sent back to jail because you couldn't pay your fines and fees. And even when you do get out of jail eventually, it's hard to get a job. It's hard to get housing. Mental health, being in jail is not good for anybody's mental health. You may have lost some social and family relationships. And then once again, you get sucked back in the revolving door of the criminal legal system. Just to give you an overview of how bad the situation is, in any given year, approximately 5.5 million people are held in pre-trial detention annually. So this is not, we're not talking about prison where you've been convicted. We're talking city and county jails. And so they are technically legally innocent, but they are in jail awaiting the resolution of their case. The majority are living in financial precarity at the time, 60 to 90%. About a quarter of people report being unemployed in the 30 days prior to arrest. So, not a stable income coming in. When we look at the median income of people detained in jail before their arrest, it's less than $20,000. And over 80% of people who are currently in jail cannot afford to pay their bail. And and many would not be there if they could pay their bail, they would be awaiting trial at home. Looking specifically at people who are unhoused, we see that most states and DC criminalize being unhoused through these kinds of laws I was talking about earlier, the no loitering, no panhandling, no sleeping outside laws. And for this population in particular, they're frequently being arrested, detained in jail briefly, let go, rearrested. We see about 40% of unhoused defendants are booked into local jails multiple times a year. And the median jail stay is 14 days. And research shows that even one day in jail has a lot of collateral consequences. So if one day in jail is bad, 14 days in jail is really bad. Now, when you are, as I mentioned briefly before, when you're awaiting trial in jail instead of awaiting trial at home, we see there's an increased risk for conviction, guilty pleas. Sometimes even innocent people will plead guilty simply so they can go home, get lengthier sentences. And then because of all of that has happened, people often end up being arrested again for future crimes. When you are booked into jail, any kind of government benefits you have are often terminated. And so there's a huge loss in benefits for people who are being detained pre-trial. And as you can imagine, it's much harder to get a job after you've been incarcerated. There's a lot of laws and stuff, and Jen's going to talk about some of that, about who can get what jobs after with a criminal record. And similarly, many people who have a criminal record are unable to get housing, and so this is a huge problem for a lot of the population in the US. I'm going to pivot here a little bit and focus on the individual for a moment. Throughout this webinar series, we've seen the consequences of poverty on health and development. And I wanted to briefly mention the cognitive consequences of poverty because going through the legal system is not easy. There's lots of decisions to be made and lots of big, fancy, lawyerly words for people to understand. And research by psychologists and behavioral economists have shown that when people who are living in poverty experience a higher cognitive load and a focus more on immediate rewards and consequences. And often people living in poverty do not think long term. They're thinking, what immediate needs do I have? Can't think long term. We also see a decrease in cognitive capacity, fluid intelligence, and executive control. And so you take, and I should add, I definitely don't want to skip over this. We see that when you give people money, these cognitive consequences evaporate. This is a situation that people are in. The poverty is causing the cognitive load and the lack of executive control. And when the poverty is alleviated, these cognitive consequences are also alleviated. And so being able to have get through the legal system when you're living in poverty is sort of a kind of like a doubling down, right? You don't have the money, but also your cognitive ability is just way overtaxed at this point. And so at this point, I am going to turn it over to Jen to talk about reforms.
Thanks, Sarah. So we are focusing on three main reforms here. There are obviously a number of reforms that we could do to improve how the legal system treats individuals living in poverty. But we think these are some ones that are actionable and really relevant for the current moment, given some of the recent activities that have been happening in the administration and the legal systems. So our first recommendation is to preserve and expand cashless bail. So in a executive order in August of last year, President Trump is trying to end cashless bail, saying that this lets individuals get out and offend with impunity. It doesn't, and they won't show up if they come back. But the research really shows that this is not the case. When we implement, or we've seen an implementation of cashless bail across different places in the US, that there's still really high court appearance rates for those individuals, and we don't see a significant increase in crime. And the real benefit of cashless bail is that it allows individuals who might be living in financial precarity to maintain their employment, their housing, their mental health support, their familial and social supports. And so we see that a lot of those negative consequences that Sarah talked about are alleviated because they get to remain outside of the prison system. And it's not only beneficial for the defendants themselves, it's beneficial for society. This reduces significantly jail costs. Some estimates say up to $14 billion a year. And when you couple cashless bail with validated risk assessments to determine those release conditions, so the conditions on which someone receives pretrial release from prison, you could save up to $78 billion. So really using those tools to tell you who's likely to come back or not, who's likely to cause or have other legal charges brought up against them while they're outside, can really help reduce those costs to the legal system. So although there are those misconceptions about people not coming back, et cetera, we see that that's not the case. And so this is really a reform that can easily impact people's lives for the better. Our next one recommendation is to combat homelessness and housing instability. And specifically, we're pointing out housing first and permanent supportive housing models. So these are models where individuals are given their housing, usually without any sort of requirement to engage in, for example, substance use counseling, mental health treatment, or other types of programs. And in the city of Grants Pass versus Oregon, the Supreme Court ordered that it was legal to criminalize certain behaviors associated with poverty, such as camping on public land. And there is a recent executive order ending crime and disorder on America's streets, also passed last summer, that basically said that housing first models don't work because they don't address the root causes of homelessness, and that they endanger public safety because they don't do that. But the research really shows that they do that, right? People are much more likely to get a benefit out of a treatment program when they're ready and they choose to engage in those programs. And what we see is that giving people housing first provides them the stability that they need in order to effectively engage in treatment. And so we see improved mental health, improved housing stability, reduced substance use, and reduced legal system contact when we give people housing first and then let them get into treatment for any issues that they may have, behavioral health needs that they may have once they have that stability. And then our last recommendation is sort of a broad umbrella of limiting collateral consequences of conviction. And these can run the gamut. Collateral consequences can do a number of things, including banning you from certain types of employment or licensure for certain types of employment. So, and so that obviously makes it harder to become employed once one has been incarcerated because of those types of collateral consequences. But other types of collateral consequences that we're focusing on here are all related to the monetary fees that can happen when you have been arrested. So our first recommendation is really to eliminate those legal financial obligations, things like court fees, incarceration charges, post-release supervision fees. And the reason why, we think this is really important is that, again, as Sarah mentioned in that cycle of poverty, when we add these types of requirements, fees to individuals when they can't afford them, punishing people who fail to pay those sanctions with further fines, fees, and incarceration just deepens that financial precarity and creates more debt that is unlikely to be repaid. Another recommendation is for us to graduate monetary sanctions on ability to pay. So if you think about, if you were arrested and you were given a fine to pay, let's say you were charged a $5 fine. If you have plenty of disposable income, that might not mean anything to you. But if you are living with very little resources, that might be the difference between being able to pay your rent or not, right? And so comparatively, someone living in financial precarity, that fine is much harsher for them than someone else that has more resources. But monetary sanctions are often defined by statute and are the same amount for everyone, not taking into account that ability to pay and the relative harshness of that penalty. And so what we see is when we graduate monetary sanctions on ability to pay, we can control it so that the relative harshness of the penalty is the same across financial resource level. And it makes it more likely that that debt will actually be recoverable, right? So we have a huge amount of debt in this in the country that is legal fines and fees that are not considered recoverable, that's money that is unlikely to ever be repaid. And so if you make it so that people can actually repay the debt, it's actually better for the legal system, the economy, et cetera. Another piece is to eliminate fees from rehabilitative and redirection programs. So we're talking about things like diversion and deflection programs that keep people from actually entering into the legal system. So rather than going to jail or prison, we redirect those individuals into behavioral health treatment, for example, if that's what they need, et cetera. And unfortunately, the research sort of shows that that sometimes people are not successful in completing those programs, and that often is because they cannot pay the fees associated with being in those programs. which then cycles them back as not completing that can send them back to prison. And so if we eliminate those fees, it makes it likely for the people who are vulnerable to get the stability and the support that they need in order to actually do what they need to do to no longer be at risk of legal system involvement. And, these kinds of programs can be associated again also with reduced recidivism, right? And better mental health, reduced substance use, without increasing public safety risk. But all of these types of things in terms of fines and fees also can further systemic inequalities in the legal system, because we see that individuals, for example, racial and ethnic disparities in terms of who's considered eligible for those programs, who's offered those programs, but then who can afford those programs as well. And so we see fewer people of color actually successfully completing rehabilitative and redirection programs, often because of those costs associated with it. And then we want to recommend eliminating penalties as punishment for unpaid debt and predatory lending practices, right? So we see, cash bail, debt collection agencies, those sorts of things can implement very, very high fees of their own just to take those, just to borrow money in order to settle legal debts, etc. And so those can sort of spiral out of control, along with just not being able to pay the legal fines for your case itself, which can lead to further fines and sanctions in certain jurisdictions for non-payment of your fees. And so that can, again, snowball into just mounting and mounting debt, which again increases or returns people back through that cycle of poverty. So, one of the big barriers that we see is that some communities rely on these types of fines and fees to fund either their general operating budget or their court systems. But the problem that we see from that is it really leads to inequity in terms of enforcement, right? So in one community that makes their money this way, you see a lot more harsher enforcement. People are being arrested and fined for behaviors that are not being fined somewhere else, that are not being treated the same as harshly in another community. And we see that tends to be focused in communities of color or lower income communities. And so we're seeing that disparity in terms of who's being over-policed, merely to fund those communities' budgets. We also see that shifts the resources that the system is using, right? So when we see communities relying more on these fines and fees to fund their budgets, police are spending more of their time giving out those sanctions and less time they can focus on other types of crime like violent crime. And so we actually see lower violent crime clearance rates in those communities, which of course is bad for public safety. So when we think about this as a whole, right, ending criminalization of poverty really allows communities to redirect resources to those evidence-based, cost-effective solutions like housing first, like redirection models, et cetera. We can reduce poverty, homelessness, recidivism, and inequality, and increase or improve mental health, behavioral health, public safety, and taxpayer money, taxpayer savings, if we stop putting our money into the wrong programs. So we wanted to just quickly thank SPICY and Codapar, Sam and Heather for putting all of this together, as well as the American Psychology Law Society for inviting us to be the authors for this policy paper. And there's a few resources on the slide, as well as a QR code to the same, the policy paper as a whole, the website for it, that was shared in the chat by Sam as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I will turn it back over to Heather or Sam. I'm not sure who's taking over now.
That will actually be Sam. Thank you so much, though.
Great. Thank you all. We'll invite all the speakers to come back. Hi, everyone. My name is Sam Abbott. I'm the Policy and Communications Director here at SPICY. I had the pleasure of working with a lot of these authors across the entire Rethinking Inequality project on development of these papers, and it was an absolute privilege, and I think the final product is really exciting. So if you haven't yet, I would encourage you to go to www.spicy.org/rethinking inequality to download the full volume of these papers. We have a few minutes left for questions, so if you haven't already, you can drop those in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And while those are coming in, I wanted to start with a few. One for start with medical legal partnerships. This could apply to both, but there's this kind of glib phrase you sometimes hear in the policy community, which is that, quote, nothing scales. It's the idea that there are these great policy ideas that show great promise in pilots or local evaluations, and they run into these unforeseen challenges as you attempt to scale them up nationally. With these medical legal partnerships, can you talk us through maybe some of the challenges policymakers should anticipate as they scale up this idea, or where do we need new research in order to perhaps identify these potential pitfalls as this idea gains traction, which we hope it will?
Yeah, thank you. One thing I'm thinking, of course, I talked a bit about, Medicaid and Medicare reimbursing for these services and treating them as healthcare. And something that I have thought about a lot when I think about hopefully some future world in which we are scaling this up is, are we going to have enough attorneys to kind of fill this gap and provide these services? So I think that would be something I don't know what the answer to that is or the solution to that would be, but I think along with kind of scaling up these programs would be, how do we kind of create a pipeline to increase legal aid attorneys kind of being available to participate in these kind of programs. Some medical legal partnerships work actually with law schools, and so that could be another option and a way to kind of get that legal labor.
Maybe we're just a couple of years away from AI attorneys and problem solved. Dr. Perlow or Dr. Appleby, do you have thoughts on this scale issue?
Yeah, I think, I think especially when we talk about cashless bail, we have seen that implemented in a variety of sizes. And I think the biggest evidence is Illinois. They fully abolished cashless bail in 2023. They've seen really good outcomes since then. But that shows, not just a city, not just a county, right? Like we're seeing an entire state getting rid of it completely. And still seeing that they can, fund their budget in other ways. They can have public safety. They can do these things. And of course, Illinois is the only state that has fully eliminated it, but there's certainly a number of other states that have significantly curtailed cash bail in most instances. And so I think, we do see that it is something very scalable.
I guess somewhat relate to that. You give the example of Illinois that sort of went all in on eliminating cash bail. Your paper recommends sort of a suite of policy recommendations that would address the criminalization of poverty, with cashless bail being a kind of anchor point. Of these, what are some of the most sort of actionable first steps policymakers can make to reduce the criminalization of poverty at the state or local level? And is it to just dive in with cashless bail, or are there steps along the way?
Like you said, we kind of anchored it in eliminating cashless bail, because, even one day in jail is bad. There are collateral consequences, to even spending one day in jail. So, that is that's kind of why, I guess, why we anchored it there. But, you may hear the phrase, all politics is local, all criminal justice reform is also local. So, even if you can't get the governor of your state on board, you might be able to get your mayor on board for, your city or your county. And I think once, I don't know, maybe this is optimistic thinking, I don't know. Once you kind of see like one thing working, it might be easier to kind of get the foot in the door and be like, oh, and you know what actually also helps, and just kind of getting the ear of local elected officials and kind of talking to them about it, especially also the public safety piece, right? Like your elected politicians, they want to look good on public safety, and so I don't know, I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but I think kind of this is one area where you can go local and have big impact. You know, maybe you can't get them on board to fully eliminate cash bail, but you know, to curtail its use, like Jen was saying, like, okay, maybe, you know, we'll for X, Y, and Z, we'll eliminate it. And so, you know, I think there is a lot of room for what your local leaders are comfortable with, is always a good starting point. Every time one person doesn't have to spend a day in jail, that is good.
Yeah, and I would just add, you know, obviously the ideal reform is don't criminalize poverty, right? Like eliminate, repeal all of those laws so that we don't even have those individuals entering the legal system in the first place. That's a much heavier lift. It takes a lot more time, I think, in a lot of ways to change minds, to change that kind of legislation. But ideally, that's where we would go.
Um, Glad you brought up the issue of, you know, what state and local policymakers might be comfortable with, because politics will come into play with all of these proposals, and you can sort of foresee the political risks that policymakers might be thinking about. For medical legal partnerships, there's the issue of cost. And Dr. Perkins, you talked a little bit about where there's encouraging data and where, you know, more research might be needed. For cashless bail, and we've seen this actually play out in many, many examples. If somebody does commit further crimes while on bail, you know, their mugshot is in the news, and so is the judge, you know, the policymaker that pushed for this cashless bail program. There's a little political risk there when that does occur. How would you help ease policymakers' concerns about these risks, and really maybe how should the academic and advocacy community more broadly be thinking about what policymakers are weighing here?
I think that for medical legal partnerships, like I mentioned, there is more research needed on the financial impact. I'd like to see more kind of solid numbers there that show, like some of the examples, I showed a study or two on one of my slides that shows uh, um, spending a couple $100 gives tens of thousands of dollars of savings to a health system. I think we need more studies that show that and kind of solidify that so we can say, yes, we need to invest some money here, but so much more money is going to be saved if we do that. If Medicaid is paying a legal aid attorney to prevent someone from getting evicted, they are saving money on a hospital admission. So I think we need kind of more data that like kind of makes that a little more solid or a little more clear. But that's I think the general argument I would take. Small investment for a big reward and cost offset.
Scrouge those studies. Oh, you can't hear me?
I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Yeah, you were a bit garbled, but it was getting better.
I need to find those studies. I'm trying to speak a little bit louder. Something that I was thinking as I was reading all of the research as well, and it goes along with what Dr. Perkins is saying, is it would cause less strain on the overall system, which I think is what policymakers are the most interested in. And that's why we felt it was important to include that financial component in this research and what we're trying to advocate for.
Yeah, I would just echo what everyone else is saying, right? When you think about a policymaker, you have to think about what their values are, what their goals are. And, you know, if we're talking about, you know, a politician in government, right? They're going to be caring about things like budget, about public safety, about these things. And so you want to focus on the things that are relevant to their decision making and address those concerns. And that's why you know, bipartisan support for a lot of the things that we are actually recommending, because they do cost less money, because they do improve public safety. So I think, you know, finding those common goals is a really effective practice.
Great. It is 2:01. I can see some of our attendees are starting to head out to their next meeting. We did get one question from Diane, which is, can your study results be brought to our lawmakers in Washington, D.C.? And I will say, yes, that is one of the goals of this project, was to connect this psychological science and the psychological research to the policy community in something that is accessible and actionable. So in addition to our lawmakers in DC, there are lawmakers locally and nationally, as Dr. Appleby mentioned. So we encourage everyone on this webinar to, again, go to www.spici.org/rethinking inequality. Download these papers, share them with people in your community and organizations that are working on these issues, share them with any policymakers you might have relationships with. And stay tuned to SPICI and some of our communication networks, and we might have some updates on further activities and further events that will be about connecting this research and these ideas to the policy community. With that, I want to thank all of our presenters and thank everyone for joining us today for today's session. This was the third of a three-part webinar series. I am putting the prior two webinars in the chat. Those were Achieving Economic Stability and Equity-Focused Interventions. Today's session will be available on YouTube, potentially by this afternoon. And we hope that you will share it with those who might find it interesting. Until then, thank you all for joining us. Thanks to our presenters, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their afternoon. Everyone.